Good evening, and welcome to Thursdays with NAMI. My name is Peg Morrison. I'll be your host tonight. I am the Assistant Director of NAMI North Carolina. That's the National Alliance on Mental Illness North Carolina, and I'm so glad y'all are here. Thursdays with NAMI is our way of building conversations and really building community around the topic of mental health. Tonight, we'll be talking about stigma and discrimination in the workplace. We try to keep it real. We cover a lot of inspiring recovery stories, and we cover the tough parts of life too. This topic does hit home for me personally. Earlier in my career, I did feel the sting of, I'm not sure if it was stigma or discrimination or a little of both. I rarely get sick physically. When I need a day off, when I shut down, it's depression and or anxiety. And in a recent job, I was criticized for taking occasional days off just for self-care, a mental health day. Even as my coworkers needed time off, the same or more time off for the flu, bronchitis, sinus infection, whatever was going around. And it wasn't just my perception. They said it to me in those words. We took more time off than you, but you got slammed for your mental health days. So yeah, I got a little lecture on attendance and I wasn't very happy about it. But after that, I just made up some physical symptoms when I needed to take a day. Problem solved. Yuck. Good thing we got parity going on, right? Anywho, there are a lot of us who struggle with these questions. When can I be transparent about a mental health diagnosis? And what should employers be doing to comply with ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and other laws? So tonight we'll be learning from the experience and wisdom of two awesome authorities on the subject, Chris Hodgson, an attorney with disability rights, and Danei Edelen, my favorite mental health advocate in Ohio, in Brown County. I had to cover myself there.
There you go.
So we'll be meeting with them in just a moment. As usual, the first part of the show will be an interview with our guests. Halfway through, we'll show a video of the week, and then we'll spend time taking questions from you, members of our virtual studio audience, live on Facebook and Zoom. Now we're going to have a quick word from our sponsors. Thursdays with NAMI is funded in part by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Use Services through the Federal Community Mental Health Block Grant Fund. How's my radio voice, Danei?
It's great. I love it.
I try to speed through that part. So now I'm so pleased to introduce Chris and Danei. In addition to being president of NAMI Brown County in Ohio, Danei is a writer and a mental health advocate. She's the recipient of the Ohio News Media Hooper Award for an original column on mental health. Attorney Chris Hodgson joined Disability Rights in 2015 after graduating from UNC School of Law. In 2020, he was promoted to target leader on the community inclusion team. Welcome, both of you.
Welcome. Thank you. It's usually me saying welcome.
Well, welcome all. Welcome to our guests. So you can go in whichever order you prefer. We always like to know the background of our guests, what sort of drew you to mental health. Tell us about yourselves in two nutshells.
Well, I'll start. I am a wife. I'm a mother. I enjoy drawing, knitting, and I live with my husband and son on 13.5 acres east of Cincinnati, out here in rural God's country. I really appreciate being a part of the NAMI family. Like so many people, mental illness is not something that you hope in life to experience, but I did. And NAMI really was a lifesaver for me and is my extended family. So so a lot of exciting things have happened for me, after, having a psychotic break in my 40s. So there is life after a mental illness diagnosis.
All right. And Chris.
So I've been in the world of disability for really since my early 20s, and started as a working different providers, helping people with developmental disabilities, and most of them had also had mental health disabilities, to kind of commingling disabilities. And I had no idea I wanted to be attorney until really several years as a provider, and realizing that there's just a lack of services in the community, wanting to do something about it. So I finally decided to go to law school, and I knew the entire time that I wanted to do disability rights and wanted to focus in on civil rights for people with disabilities. So I was able to latch on to Disability Rights North Carolina afterwards, and I've been there since, loving the work that I do.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you both on as a panel, because you're both taking a very powerful approach to advocacy. Danei, with your lived experience and speaking your truth fearlessly, and Chris taking the legal approach and using a well-honed set of skills to make change on a structural level. So thank you both for all of the work that you've done and continue to do. Danei, you were let go from a job after your first psychiatric hospitalization. I can only imagine how difficult that would be. It does provide an example of what employers should not be doing when someone has a mental health challenge. Can you share that story with us?
Yes. As I said to Peg earlier, this isn't my favorite story, but I did go through the NAMI training, how to talk about these difficult topics, because this is the only way we're going to bring stigma to light. And after I had a psychotic break, I went back to school. I had a bachelor's degree in communication, but I also went back to school to get a market research certificate at Northern Kentucky University. That in itself was a challenge, to go back to school and go through that process. I will always remember the last week of school, I had a 4.0 and a job offer, and I was elated. And so I remember driving to work. I was very open with HR about the fact that I had a mental illness, not necessarily that I had a psychotic break, but I had a mental illness. And I worked at that company for about 3 years, and it just became too much. And so this was, before COVID hit. So I consulted a friend of mine who was a lawyer, and he helped me craft a letter requesting 1 day working virtual legal, a reasonable accommodation. Is interesting. I had what I thought was a good relationship with the HR person, but that really turned out not to be the case. When I presented the letter to the owner of the company, he said to me, "Well, I think due to your health, you should work somewhere else." Well, that's obviously, discrimination. And, as I was driving home crying, calling my lawyer friend, he's like, "Danei, I know you're upset, but go home and write everything you remember about that conversation." And I did. And despite the fact that he had one of the best law firms in the city, and I was a wreck, felt like a wreck inside, I was able to pursue legal action. And so it wasn't difficult. It was extremely difficult, but my sense of right and wrong within myself, I needed to do it.
Mm-hmm. So just to be clear, you were upfront with them from day one about a mental health condition?
Yeah, I was.
Wow, I applaud your courage.
Well, and reflecting on it now, now I didn't put it on an application, but I said, I have a medical, like I said, I had a relationship with the HR person and made her aware of it. So, I wasn't, it was just more about, look, I have a mental health condition or something like that. But it was, in hindsight, it was, I felt it was what I needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, and Chris, you can speak to this more, that it is an individual issue for each and every person.
Whether to disclose your mental health
Yes,
status?
absolutely, yes.
Do you regret at all that you were so above board with it?
No, in that I sleep well at night, you know. So I'm not a regrets person. Yes, tough things have happened to me. But I choose to move on. And you know, there are some wonderful events. Once I found the NAMI world, like you, Peg, I found a community of safe, supportive people. And I found an ability to, you know, tell my story and speak my truth, as you said. And so, if I had not gone through what I went through, I could not be doing what I'm doing now, which is, you know, launching a speaking business, starting a YouTube channel, you know, so, you know, I don't choose to look back, you know, I choose to move forward. And as a friend of mine said, you know, Danei, you've seen a side of mental health that few people have seen, but you have the skills, talents, and abilities to bring about change. And if you know, how are things going to change otherwise?
Well,
So,
go ahead.
well, so that keeps me going.
That's very inspiring. Every time I talk to you, I'm inspired, and each time it feels new. So, yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story. It is a tough thing to disclose. I probably err on the side of, you know, sharing my mental health status earlier with friends, work, whoever, rather than later, because I don't want to invest too much. If that's a deal breaker, tell me now. But I'm so lucky and fortunate that I work in NAMI, where it's actually an asset. So, yeah. All right, Chris, we know it's illegal for an employer to discriminate simply because someone has a mental health condition. What does that mean in real life from what you've seen?
I tend to break discrimination down into types of discrimination, because it's not just one type of discrimination that people experience. So there's just what we call intentional discrimination. So I understand, you know, I know that you have a mental health impairment, and because of that, I'm taking negative action against you. I'm not going to hire you. I'm not going to promote you. Or I'm going to start harassing you. Those are all types of really what we call intentional discrimination. But there's also discrimination that occurs from just policies and procedures that screen out people with disabilities from jobs. Think of like mental health questionnaires that they just start having people fill out before they start a job. So there's these type of just broader policies that happen that may not have intent behind them, but the result is that they're screening out people from jobs, and if it's doing so unnecessarily, that in and of itself is a form of discrimination. Then there's failure to accommodate type claims. So if you have a disability and you need an accommodation, you can request reasonable accommodations, and as long as it's not an undue hardship, they're supposed to be granted. Employers can provide what they call alternative accommodations if those alternatives also meet your needs. Those are all kind of different types of discrimination that anybody could experience. And that failure to accommodate, that's not intent. It doesn't matter whether they are trying to discriminate or not. The discrimination is not providing the accommodation.
Thank you for that, for clarifying that and breaking it down. And, it occurs to me that, just to be clear with Danei's story, you won your settlement, Danei, correct? That was a victory for you.
We settled out of court. I cannot disclose anything related to the settlement. So I feel vindicated, but I can't disclose anything related to it.
Okay. Is it okay if I call it a win?
Sure.
That's a win. That's a win. Heck yeah. Okay. All right. So back to Chris. What is reasonable accommodation? How do they define reasonable?
Well, an accommodation is any change to the workplace. So reasonable, it's a standard that needs to apply to every type of job. every area of work. So that becomes very fact specific and very individualized as to what's reasonable. But it's not supposed to be a demanding test. If it's considered reasonable in a general sense, such as requesting a couple days off work in order to treat an impairment. So that's what's kind of considered a fairly reasonable accommodation. It doesn't strike anybody as completely unreasonable. So there's this idea that it needs to be generally reasonable. And then it kind of switches, and it's really at that point, it's the employer's responsibility or obligation, if they're going to deny that accommodation, to explain why for them it's an undue hardship. And so that means that it's a perfectly reasonable accommodation. It might just be something about the employer that it's hard to do. It's hard to provide this accommodation. And that's their defense. They actually have to bring proof to show why it is it's administratively difficult, why it is it would create staffing problems, those type of situations. But initially, you just have an initial obligation to show that what you're presenting is reasonable. And then at that point, the obligation really switches to the employer to explain why, okay, it may be generally reasonable, but it's not reasonable for us, the employer, and here's why.
Okay.
And that's why it ends up being very fact specific. You have to really go into what's the accommodation being asked, what type of job it is, to really make an analysis of it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And tell us about the Family Medical Leave Act.
So the FMLA it's different than the ADA. So the ADA is a civil rights bill. The FMLA applies to any employee, and it's basically you have to work for a place for at least a year, but at that point you can take up to, I think it's 12 weeks a year of leave for serious health conditions. And there's also an obligation for the employer to notify you of this right that you have as an employer.
Okay. It seems to come into play for folks I know with mental health challenges or whatever challenge, that they might need a chunk of time off, and they rely on FMLA, as they call it, to achieve that. Do you see a big role for that in the disabled folks that you work with?
I mean, that's what it's a built-in protection that is for yourself or a family member. So it is used quite often. You can also use the ADA to request leave as an accommodation. What's reasonable when you're asking for a leave? A lot of times that depends on whether or not it's how long a leave you're asking for, and kind of how indefinite it is. So if you're going in there asking like, I need to take leave, but I can't tell you when I'm coming back, a lot of courts have said that, well, that's an unreasonable request. But if you have a very specific amount of time that you're requesting, and the employer can grant it, then it does become reasonable. So you can actually ask leave as both an FMLA right as well as an ADA accommodation.
Okay, well, that's good to know too. Thank you. So Danei, what did it do to your mental health to lose your job after that hospitalization?
Well, it traumatized me, obviously. I mean, it was another traumatic event. My family, for my own mental health reasons, they didn't want me to pursue legal action. So, it was traumatizing to go through that process. But the interesting thing through that process, until then, I had not really found a community of safe, supportive people. And it was in the process of contacting disability rights and those organizations that I got connected with NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, was able to connect with a local chapter in Cincinnati, NAMI Southwest, and really started to get more educated on my mental health conditions as a peer, and dove into all the NAMI classes with my background in marketing. NAMI has a program called In Your Own Voice, where you learn to tell your story. And that's where I really learned to talk about my mental illness. And, you know, we would go to a class in a college or wherever, and people afterward would say, "You're so courageous." And it was like, what? Talking about it is the easy part, managing everything else, or, what I lived through before was really difficult.
Right.
And so what was really wonderful was when I had the opportunity to go back to my county, Brown County, and found a NAMI affiliate with Peg's help and others from NAMI Ohio at the time. In July, we celebrated 5 years, and that's for a nonprofit affiliate. That's an accomplishment, and I was glad to be able to share that news with Dan Gillison, the CEO of NAMI, at the NAMI Southwest Ohio conference this summer. So, back to some of, I think it depends on how you view what you've lived through. And as I said earlier to you, Peg, I recently was highlighted in an Authority magazine article called A Mental Health Champion. And of course, I also was able to write and begin writing for community papers, and I won the Ohio News Media Hooper Award for my original column related to mental health. So, I think gratification can come sometimes when you demonstrate courage.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well said. Yeah. It doesn't surprise me that you've done so well. You've always been someone who had a positive energy and a positive approach to doing things, and then you went forth and actually did them. So I always appreciated that. And Chris, that's probably true of you as well. I don't know you as well. So Chris, what resources are available to help folks who are facing stigma and discrimination at work because of their mental health condition?
The first thing we usually recommend is, if you're looking at for accommodations, the Job Accommodation Network, they call it JAN. JAN is basically a neutral resource that's created by the federal government for both employers and employees to go to. It's a wonderful resource. You can basically go in there and put in your disability, and it will give you types of accommodations that people with your disability have asked for in the workplace. And they also provide a little bit of guidance on there too, provide some specific questions and answers. So it's a really nice resource that's supposed to be neutral for all employers and employees. AskJan.org. Yeah, just saw it up there.
Perfect. I've never heard of that.
If you're feeling like you're being discriminated against, certainly reaching out to your local protection advocacy agency. In North Carolina, that's Disability Rights North Carolina, but there's a protection advocacy agency in each state. So you should be able to identify that organization and we provide at least legal information, and we can also provide representation depending on our resources.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one more resource I would recommend is that you feel like this is kind of another, if you feel like you need accommodations, and we always think about like the employer has to provide them, but there's also vocational rehabilitation. And vocational rehabilitation is a federal program that's designed to assist people with disabilities obtain jobs and retain them and advance in their jobs. So they can provide supports for anybody with a disability who qualifies to help them with employment.
That's true. That's possibly an overlooked solution for some folks. If you need help with skills or help with job placement, there are definitely some programs out there that can be helpful. That would be no cost to the person participating. So that's a great reminder. And Danei, when you were struggling with the work situation and being mistreated. What kinds of support did you receive from friends and loved ones? What was helpful, unhelpful?
Well, I think one of the things that was really critical, I mean, I did talk about the fact that that is after this happened, after the fact that I found NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I think in a lot of ways, before NAMI, my family didn't know what to do. In a lot of ways, it was that big black hole of mental illness, and she's sick, and you know what, let's put her in cotton balls, you know, idea. And so I think what was really critical is my family got trained, and they are a part of a local NAMI affiliate as well. I think a lot, and this is really has to do with the person, and each person is different. But I think that underlying education is needed by all families, regardless of who their loved one is. And that, so I think that helped my immediate circle. I think what's important is for anyone that's dealing with a mental illness in a stressful work environment is you have to find that community of safe, supportive people that weathers you through the storms of life. And that's what NAMI does, is we are there when you're doing well, and we're there when you're not doing well. And that's it's the critical piece. My family meant well, but they didn't necessarily always know. And as we all know, mental illness stigma itself is sometimes worse than the illness itself. Some research has currently shown. So it's that education that I think is really key for family and people who care.
Great points. There's definitely a skill deficit in the average bear when it comes to mental health challenges. People don't know how to react. I mean, sometimes they're just afraid and like, I just can't go there at all. And sometimes they think they're being helpful. It's like the person who talks louder to someone who's speaking a different language. It's like, that's not the intervention that is needed.
Right.
So yeah, and that's what NAMI is about. And that's why we were talking before the show started. People find us when they need us. They find us when they're desperate. We're not quite a household name yet, but I do feel that with the pandemic, mental health awareness has increased. So if we're lucky, that trend will continue and we'll continue making strides. Yeah. So we've got a question from someone in the audience, anonymously. For Chris, do you recommend first filing an EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, I think that is, claim if you believe that you have been discriminated against for your mental disability that has led to your termination or a constructive discharge?
So that, yes, and the EEOC is basically a step you have to go through in order to ever bring a lawsuit down the road, and you only have 180 days to do so. So it's not something you can wait on. So when you feel like you've been discriminated against, it's important to file what's called a charge of discrimination with the EEOC. Usually what happens is you set up an appointment with them and they kind of draft the charge for you. It's not something where you need an attorney. It's really a process that is, because it's the federal government, it's supposed to be a step that people can use before you ever have to worry about a lawsuit. So you can file a charge. At that point, the EEOC will have somebody who investigates it, and they will say whether or not there's merit to your charge, and they can actually organize a settlement after that, settlement discussions between the parties. They can also order the employer to undergo changes with its policies and procedures.
Okay. And another follow-up question. If you work for a small business in North Carolina that has fewer than 15 employees, they may not be required to provide a reasonable accommodation in the workplace. That was my situation. How do you recommend handling an employer who is exempt but mocks your mental disability? Ouch, that's awful. I'm sorry you had to go through that, anonymous question person.
So this gets at really one of the weaknesses of the ADA. The ADA, I mean, it is a compromise. It was a compromise between the employer and civil rights community. So not everything in there is like exactly what you would want if you're a person with a disability. There are limitations. One of the things that Congress put in there is the small employer exception, which is what this individual is talking about. And unfortunately, there's just nothing that can really be done about that particular issue from a legal standpoint. They've been exempted from the Americans with Disabilities Act. You know, if the employer was receiving federal funding or something like that, there might be other laws that apply that prohibit that type of discrimination. But other than that, as well as if there was some state funding potentially, but you know, it's really a limitation of the law that it's not going to apply to most small employers like that.
This seems like a good time to bring up NAMI support groups, and this is not a direct answer to that kind of challenge, but it could bring some relief. If you go to a NAMI support group, it's a free support group, and there are many other types of support groups, but of course I'm a NAMI gal, so that's what I'm familiar with. They're virtual. We have them all over the state, and wherever you are, you can join because it's online. So you don't have to drive. You just plug into Zoom and you'll meet other people who have had similar experiences. They'll understand, they might have suggestions. At a bare minimum, it's very liberating to realize you're not alone. You know, many of us have been bullied. Many of us have faced stigma in a very difficult and hurtful way. I was at a very low point with my mental health in grad school, and I would sit down and people would move out of the chairs near me, which was pretty brutal, but you can recover from those awful, awful situations. You can find your tribe and find success on your own terms and learn to love yourself and maybe even love the world a little bit again. So I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Any other thoughts, Danei or Chris?
No, I love the find your tribe. I think that's right.
Well, I just, as you know, I'm a big NAMI proponent myself, and I do think it's a place where you can come and vent your feelings in a safe, confidential environment. And as one of the NAMI executives said at the NAMI Ohio conference, friends help friends. And you know, once you become a part of the NAMI world, you are in the NAMI family, and we know there's a lot of the system itself is fragmented and in crisis based, but we try, you know, to help each other with our lived experience through the NAMI support groups. So.
Absolutely. Okay. So this question is for both of you. Are there laws or policies that you'd like to see changed to help folks with mental illness to live and work successfully in the community?
Well, I'll let Chris answer the laws and policies. We have actually, as you alluded to, Peg, we have made tremendous strides due to COVID. You know, mental health awareness is the silver lining related to COVID. And, you know, when I started writing a decade ago, it was considered career suicide to be out about my mental illness and write about it. But yet, you know, I won the Ohio News Media Hooper Award. And so there has been a sea change, perhaps more incremental than I would like in our society with the, particularly with regards to like Michael Phelps, Simone Biles, you know, the celebrities who have come out with regards to their mental illness. And so we are seeing it on a kind of macro level. What we need to see is more people like me who are your neighbor, your friend, you know, that kind of thing. So it becomes more normalized.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And Chris, what are your thoughts?
I tend to think of these issues as somewhat being bundled in terms of you don't have access to good quality mental health services, if you don't have access to good housing, it's going to affect your employment. So much of the stuff we talk about, it has a trickle effect around people's lives. And just having a good social service network that's around people and that's provides really necessary basic elements that any human being needs to have in order to thrive needs to be there. So from a policy standpoint, that's what we should be pushing and working for. And then just for the legal aspect of it, I would like to see more affirmative hiring policies created around people with disabilities. We've talked about kind of, should you tell or should you not tell? Well, the one time when we know that it's really good to tell is when the employer is actually hiring people with disabilities, because they're saying, we actually take that as a plus. And that has an effect on work culture around it when people put affirmative hiring practices into place. We've seen that with government jobs and some in the private sector, but I think that's a place where there could be a lot of expansion and a lot of good done. Yeah, I'll just say that too. And just basically improving our work cultures and work expectations, thinking more about not the way a job is done, but what the end product looks like. And that's more of how we should be judging jobs.
Right. NAMI North Carolina, I agree with everything you've said. And it reminds me of our need for Medicaid expansion. The first thing you said was, let's get care more available and accessible, regardless of income, regardless of whatever. And Medicaid expansion would be a wonderful step towards that. In North Carolina, over 500,000 people would have access to mental health and other health care. It would be a profound game changer, because when we don't do the preventative care, when we put things off, we have to choose between groceries and rent and medication. That's when our health problems start to build up. And by the time we feel bad enough that we have to get care, we're in worse shape. It's much more expensive. If you're someone where money talks the loudest and the best, it's much cheaper to do preventative health care and take care of ourselves in real time and not end up with the massive heart attack or the whatever results from years of neglecting our mental health. It could be different kinds of trauma. So go Medicaid expansion. All right. And what gives you hope?
Well, what I'd like to say is, if I had to have a mental illness, I'm glad it's now. If you know anything about the history, that for people like me, that it really is. I'm glad that I had it now. I'm glad that I found a community of safe, supportive people who value me and my family. And I am, through launching NAMI Brown County, I have affected lives in my community, which making a difference. That goes to a sense of purpose, which I think is key for each and every one of us. And continuing on that, I'm launching a YouTube channel called Mental Health Warrior, and continuing to launch a speaking business as well. So, it was because of that support and the current economic conditions, quite honestly, that I am thinking about, taking on stigma even on a larger scale. So.
Right on. Chris?
I have an unusual job in that the people who contact us are not people who good things have happened to. Either people who have experienced discrimination or believe they've experienced discrimination. So most of my job is around people who are working through issues of discrimination. I think what gives me hope is it's just seeing generational change and seeing mental health treatment be more accepted in society, and kind of seeing those changes. And I am a big believer that the more good exposure there is out there in our culture, more accepting that we are around mental health treatment, that absolutely translates to a work culture. Why wouldn't it? So I do have hope that we're moving in a process that we're going to see change, but it's going to be incremental. We're just kind of all part of an evolving process that's, if we're lucky, is going to continue to get better and better.
Right. And I think the more we can have conversations that detoxify mental illness, and also conversations where we can hear people with viewpoints that don't match our own, the more we can have those civil and kind conversations, the further along the path that we'll get together. So, all right, we're going to pivot away from the interview part of our show. Before we move to our video of the week, I want to give a great big shout out to our hero working behind the scenes, App State social work intern, Caitlin Rita. Thanks for being there, Caitlin. You're always helpful and inspiring. And of course, thanks again to Danei and Chris for spending your evening with us and sharing your story and your expertise. Now we've got a super fun video of the week. Someone asked in a recent evaluation survey, hey, we see dogs in the videos. What about the NAMI North Carolina mascot? So by popular demand, this video shows Juniper Morrison, the coonhound, who is our mascot. Aw. We try to go with something light for the video of the week, take a little break from the heavy stuff. Now it's time to answer your questions, members of our virtual studio audience on Zoom and Facebook, and we'll keep going as long as there are questions within reason. All righty, and so y'all can answer this in whatever order you'd like. What tips do you have for job seekers who are looking for employers who are supportive of things being discussed here tonight? So I think that's how to link up with those supportive employers.
Some of them advertise. I mean, usually the ones that are smart, if they're trying to be inclusive, they'll use that as part of their marketing criteria. But in terms of like the affirmative hiring policies I talked about, you're probably going to find those most in federal and state jobs, where they have some obligations to develop hiring practices around hiring people with disabilities. So that's where you see some affirmative hiring policies that have actually been enacted. Other than that, I can't just name off employers, but there are employers that have marketed their hiring practices around hiring people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Danei, any thoughts?
Well, I think you kind of start with what you know and start with what are gifts. For me, a part of what helped me was the cathartic ability to write, and continuing to write is something that I'm passionate about. I think part of what you have to go through is a kind of evaluation of what are my skill sets and what am I passionate about, and that's a balance, of how do you pay the bills, how do you feed your passion, that kind of thing. And so I think I just think that with what we are seeing in our culture with regards to suicide, finding a community of safe, supportive people and healthy environment is really critical. I mean, we're seeing a lot of men in their 50s, that are, have no way, I feel like they have no way out. And so, that's why it might seem, that's why I just can't underscore enough the community of a safe, supportive environment is really critical for, I think, everyone. whatever that looks like for you, it is really an individual decision.
Mm, right. It varies so much from person to person. I would say too, when you find that safe, supportive place, you find your tribe or a support group where you're comfortable. Maybe it's a chess club, maybe it's a volleyball team. Maybe ask those folks, do you know of any openings? I'm looking for a job. Once you find people who speak your language, they might be aware of places, other places in their life that they're aware of, where people speak that language of recovery and hope, or at least have an overall culture of compassion, inclusion, and understanding people who are a little different. Next question. Thanks for the questions, folks. Do you ever recommend talking with coworkers about the advantages in the workplace rather than just the disabilities? For example, having ADHD or autism. Oh, I see.
So
About
kind of identifying the strengths of one's disability. I think that's absolutely wonderful.
right.
We've kind of talked about this earlier, and when to tell or not to tell that you had a disability. I tend to be fairly risk adverse just because I'm an attorney. But there's a lot to say for telling people fairly upfront that this is my disability. I own it. I accept it. This is part of me. And I understand that from a completely personal standpoint of why that's important. So I don't think there's a right or no. There's not an answer for when somebody should or should not tell, except if you want an accommodation. If you want an accommodation, you do need to let them know that you have a disability, and this is the accommodation you need. So anytime you really have to disclose is when you're getting into the process of asking for an accommodation. But there's just a lot of good value, I think, also. And if you're in an environment that you're comfortable enough, and if you think it's important for you personally to live outwardly with your disability, that is a good choice. And if they discriminate against you for it, you should be able to hold them responsible for it.
All right. Yeah, I think that's a really insightful question. If I'm going to self-disclose, there's certainly no downside to talking about the strengths that it gives me. I think if you are someone who lives with mental health challenges, a lot of us end up with a pretty deep sense of empathy, a pretty broad ability to accept other people. I'm just thinking of the people I know. I tell people about working at NAMI that I meet people who have been through the ringer, and they come out the other side with certain superpowers, and that's recovery, resilience, empathy. So there are definitely some silver linings. All right. So we've got our lull in the question. Oh, a nice comment from Grant in the chat box. The IT industry tends to be more open with their hiring practices, I find. We've done some partnering with Red Hat, and they have a diversity committee, and one of their areas of diversity which they honor and celebrate is neurodiversity or neurodivergence, which is a more new and hip way of saying mental health challenges. So it's pretty exciting. I'll make some announcements while we have a lull in the questions. Please join us next week. We've got a really interesting author. Her name is Haley Kaplan. She bought her husband a back scratcher on their 7th anniversary and said something about the 7-year itch. I hope this helps you with it. And then she found herself having an affair that same year, and through a lot of therapy and going through a lot of issues, realized that she needed to work on boundaries and codependency. And she wrote a book about her story to help other people deal with whatever codependent challenges they might be facing. So join us next week and meet author Haley Kaplan. Please fill out our survey. If you're with us on Zoom, fill out the survey that will magically appear at the end of our show. It helps us learn from what we do, improve over time, and it's good karma for you. So let us know how you felt about tonight. Also, if you'd like to be a speaker here on Thursdays with NAMI, you can fill out the survey and put your contact information in. So that would be wonderful too. Chris and Danei, is there anything we haven't covered that you would like to be sure to say?
One thing I wanted to talk about, I think I had in my notes, that kind of how to handle toxic workplaces.
Mm,
'Cause this is, there's nothing in the law to say that like toxic workplaces aren't in and of themselves discriminatory, but lots of times they affect people with disabilities more so than people without disabilities. So the way the law really addresses that is that, like, and it could be a toxic work environment, it could be a bad boss. It's if the bad boss is bad to everybody, that's not discrimination. But the way you can handle that is to request an accommodation, and it can be something that changes the way the manager interacts with you. If they're always throwing you under the bus last second and putting you under a lot of pressure, you can try to create an accommodation around that. I mean, you can really think an accommodation is a change to the way the workplace is operating. I mean, is that broad? So you can come up with a lot of reasonable accommodations that address your needs. And you just have to, you'll probably have to get some medical documentation to verify that this is a disability, this is a limitation that you're having, but it's something you could put in place. I always say you want to get the accommodations before you fail or before you get in trouble with your employer. You don't want to get the bad write-up and then start asking for accommodations. So if you feel like this is where it's heading and something's wrong something's not happening in your performance and you know why, and it can be addressed through an accommodation, those are the types of questions that you should be asking so that you're not having to react to a situation. You're able to kind of proactively address it. And it always helps to ask for an accommodation before you get a bad job performance review.
wow, that is great advice. Thank you. Danei?
Yeah, I think what's important is you have to. I don't like the like know myself, but there's a self-awareness that you really have to gauge, and what you can manage, and that balance of moving forward. I mean, I'm kind of a charge person, in charge mode. Even before I got related, when my husband first met me, I was crusading for a cause, so there was a little bit in the genes there. But you have to be able to be self-aware to understand, okay, this has become too toxic for me, or yes, I can manage this, this level here. I think that's we don't do enough in our culture to really help people with the process of managing their emotions, and that's really key. And that's partially why I'm launching, for people like me who've been hospitalized, my channel. And so I think that it's having an awareness within yourself of what is good for you, and being able to navigate appropriately. And so I hope that's helpful.
That's an excellent point. And as I think, especially for young people, emotional literacy, emotional intelligence, and self-knowledge, boy, I was just lost. It took me a long time to learn those lessons and really understand communication and the energy I was sending to other people, and how other people's energy was affecting me. It's complex. It's a journey. So really good points, Danei and Chris. Thank you so much. It looks like people have asked the questions they need to ask. So if you have any closing arguments or closing thoughts, go ahead.
Well, I just
arguments. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, I appreciate being a part of the panel, and this is an important topic. And please, if you are feeling isolated or alone during this holiday season, please know you're not alone, and there's a NAMI affiliate near you.
Okay. Well, once again, Danei and Chris, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing your stories, your expertise, your words of wisdom. I learned a lot tonight, and yeah, it just brings it home, I guess. We're all struggling. We're all trying to find a way to walk in the direction of recovery and hope, and figure out rules that work for us, and where is our tribe and where is our safe place. And as Danei said, if you're feeling like you're out of sync and not able to find those things, you need someone to talk to, you feel alone and isolated, please give us a call at NAMI. We want to hear from you. We've been there and we'll get it, I promise. All right. Thanks everyone, and have a wonderful night.
Bye-bye.